purpose of our test was to assess student understanding of musical texture and form, and how texture can be used to create form in a composition. Of the original 17 7th grade students, 13 completed the assessment. These students have had no formal assessment of musical aptitude. All students receive music education throughout elementary school. However, their most recent music educational experience focused heavily on guitar accompaniment of modern music. Students have likely not received instruction on musical elements since 5th grade or earlier. Class is held every other day for 45 minutes per class period. This can cause problems with retention, as classes can sometimes go up to a week without instruction if an extended break coincides with a week of 2 meetings.
Hi everyone, my name's Sarah Hill and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about our unit of study. So for week 1, we really wanted to give students a foundation for the rest of our unit by going over some key vocabulary words. So we started with first defining texture and form. So when we took a look at texture, we decided that for our purposes, we would define that as the amount of instruments playing. So we talked about thick texture being there were a lot of instruments and they could be playing very different things. We also talked about thin texture where there's only one instrument or a few instruments and there's not a whole lot musically going on. And we also defined and described form. So we said that form was the pattern that music followed, and we really focused on 3 kinds of form, which was binary, which follows the A-B pattern, ternary, which follows A-B-A, and rondo, which follows A-B-A-C-A. So again, some of these extra vocabulary words that fit in with these things were thick, where there's lots of instruments playing, thin, which, again, like I said, it's not very many instruments happening at all, and both of those had to deal with texture. And then for form, we talked about same, different, and repeating, because this is really the best way for students to be able to figure out if what they're hearing is a new form letter. If it's the same music, it's the same letter. If it changes or if it repeats back, that also helps you figure out what part of form that we have. So then, during week 2, we shifted gears and we began to use this vocabulary we learned to describe and analyze the texture of audio samples. So at the bottom, you can see a sample texture chart we used to analyze a sample of music. So the first time they listened, students would identify large changes in the music and label each section of music with a number. So the second time we listened, students would then identify the instrumentation heard during the samples, and the third time through, they would determine the instrumentation of each of those large sections. So then students would be able to visually identify where the texture is thick and thin and the changes that occur between sections. So then in week 3, we decided we would have students orally and visually analyze the texture to determine form. So students were also able to critique compositions to show the effectiveness of texture at creating form within samples. So this really came into play later for one of our extended response questions that we're going to talk about. So students would also create texture charts for hypothetical compositions to represent specific forms. So like I said, these are some of our short constructed response questions and our extended constructed responses, and we built these practice ideas right into our actual lessons. So if you take a look at the texture chart that you see here, this shows how we were able to analyze form through texture. Since sections 1, 3, and 5 have the same textures, they are labeled as A. Sections 2 and 4 have unique textures, so they are labeled B and C. So when building our assessment, we went through the same process that everyone else did about how much percentage of our instructional time was given to each concept. And then from there, we were able to break down about how much time we were going to devote to each of these concepts during the assessment. So we in our breakdown, figured out that we would have 10 questions that were concerned with defining form and defining texture. So these questions defining form and texture included both like what is the definition of this, and then what is the letter patterns, how do we label form, all sorts of questions like that. We also had 7 questions that analyzed the texture of audio samples. So for that, we would play a short snippet of many different kinds of music. We had popular music, rock music, swing music, classical music, really as much variety as we could think of, and students had to listen to about usually 15 to 20 seconds of each sample and figure out the instrumentation that occurred within that sample. We also had 5 questions determining the texture of the audio samples. So whereas the top one was really figuring out what matched with each part, where you had to match pre-given charts with what you were hearing, the next set of questions had to determine to see if you could figure out exactly which instruments you were able to hear. And then the following 8 questions after that had you combine this and be able to visually and aurally analyze the texture and the form. So we go through each part as separate, and then the final 8 questions is talking about the combination of figuring out the form through the use of texture. And then in terms of our constructed response questions, we had one short constructed response that we asked students to determine the form through visual analysis. So we had a texture chart there, and students had to write in the different labels for whether it was the A section, the B section, the C section, through based on what instrumentation they were able to see. Our other short constructed response asks students to compare the effectiveness of the form through the texture. So for that, we had 2 audio samples and 2 texture charts for those audio samples. And students had to justify which of those samples best fit binary form and describe why, using evidence both from the audio sample and from the texture charts provided. So that was asking them to do a lot of compare and contrast. And then our extended constructed response required students to create a texture chart showing a specific form. So we asked students to show rondo form through a hypothetical composition that they come up with on their own. So using the texture charts that we've been using through the whole thing, students had to first come up with different instruments they could use for this texture chart, and then figure out how to shade in the boxes that were able to represent a rondo form, which means they needed to have an A section, a B section, a C section. They were all in the appropriate locations. So in terms of analysis for our test, we really broke it down into the multiple choice sections and then the extended constructed response and the short constructed response. So in terms of our multiple choice selections, we had 30 possible points that students could earn. And out of that, the maximum score we were able to see from our students was 27, and the minimum score was 10. So the mean score for our students was 18.23. The median was 19. And we had a standard deviation of 6.41. So if you compared our actual achieved mean score and our actual achieved standard deviation, both of those were higher than what our theoretical base was, because theoretically our mean was supposed to be 15 and our standard deviation was supposed to be 5. So based on that, having a higher observed means that some of our test questions may have actually been too easy for our students, as theoretically they should have scored closer to 15, and the difference between 15 and 18 is pretty significant when we're only talking about being out of 30 points. So if we were going to administer this test again, we would be looking at some of these test items and seeing if we need to change some of them. Because as you'll see later in our best functioning and worst functioning items, some of these items just were not quite performing how we would have liked them to be. And then in terms of having a larger standard deviation, because theoretically it should have been a standard deviation of 5, and we observed it was 6.41, that essentially means that we had a wider range of scores than we thought we should see. So that would be something, again, we would look at if we were to administer this test again. But overall, the reliability coefficient that we received from the UB scoring services was 0.88, which is pretty good considering we only administered our test to 13 students. So we felt even with these trends being higher than we thought they would be, that it was still a pretty reliable test because 0.88 indicates that it was pretty strong. So then moving forward to our short constructed response 1. For this, the content that we were really looking for, as I said earlier, was being able to label the form through the analysis of the texture being seen. So we provided a texture chart with different instrumentation shaded in, and we asked students to come up with letter labels to demonstrate the form that they were seeing. So for this, they just had to simply add the letter labels above the shaded in texture chart just to see, can they identify that if these instruments are being played here and it's the same, those are both going to be a section A, and so on. So our inter-rater reliability here was 1.0, which means Mark and I, when we assessed and we graded these tests, both had the same scores throughout, which was really a testament to both the test correction. There really wasn't much interpretation here. It either was the students had the correct form letter or they didn't. And it was pretty easy for us to come up with the same answers in terms of that. So students were able to achieve a possible 15 points for this, and the average score our students got was 10.2. Both the median score and the mode score were 15, so a lot of our students did very, very well on this question. Our second short constructed response had students visually and orally analyze form through the use of texture. And we had, again, for this question, our 2 audio samples and the corresponding form charts. And students had to provide evidence both from the recordings and these charts about which of these pieces of music did a better job of representing binary form. So for this, our inter-rater reliability was 0.94. We had a rubric that went along with this, and Mark and I had very, very similar answers when we graded them. So yeah, 0.94, it worked out to be pretty good. So again, out of a possible 15 points, our average score for our students was 7.5. The median score was 7, and the mode score was 3. So this was a question either students really got it or they really struggled with it. So one of the things that our students struggled with was because we asked for evidence both from the audio sample and from the visual form chart. And a lot of our students either chose one or the other. And there actually were a few cases of students just being intimidated by the question overall and not really attempting to complete it. So that happened for us, which really overall lowered our average score. And our mode score also suffered because of that, because there were several students that just weren't quite sure how to address this because they were asking to be to use evidence from both sources, and that threw some of them off. So that's something that if we were to administer this assessment again, more of our in-class prep time would be spent actually practicing these specific kinds of questions, because our other 2 constructed response questions the students felt very comfortable with, and it just appears they're not as comfortable with this type of question, and that's something that we would address if doing this again later. And then finally, our extended constructed response, we asked students to, again, compose a hypothetical composition and through their use of the texture of this composition, demonstrate a given form. So our inter-rater reliability for this one was 0.85. We again used a rubric to assess this, and it was out of a possible 25 points. So the average score of our students was 20.8, so they did very well on this question. Our median score was 23, and our mode scores, we actually had 2 of 23 and 25, and we had 4 students score each of those. And going through, again, our students did very well because they had to come up with their own instruments. So they had to come up with enough unique instruments that they were able to demonstrate a composition showing these different forms. So they came up with their instruments, they shaded it in, and they had it correspond with letter labels that they had to include above. And yeah, it went very well for our kids. Again, this is something that we spent a lot of time in week 3 of our unit on, and they were able to achieve very well here. So when taking a look at some of our test items that were our highest functioning, best functioning items on our test, we had 5 of our questions, and they were all multiple choice questions, and they had a discrimination value ranging from the highest at 0.92 all the way down to our 5th best functioning item, which was 0.69. So one of the things that's notable about these questions is almost all of these questions used all plausible distractors, so they were able to really disperse students equally amongst the 4 choices, meaning that the distractors were very, very likely. And most of them, again, were right in that sweet spot of difficulty between 40% and 70% of students achieving them. So that meant that they were able to kind of filter students the way that we wanted them to see if they really knew the questions. So question 23 was actually our best performing question in terms of the discrimination value of 0.92. And that question asked students to visually analyze form. So we had 4 different texture charts, and there was no audio sample with this one. It was just a visual analysis. And out of the 4 texture charts displayed, students had to select the one that most closely resembled binary form. So, like we said, all 4 of these answer choices were utilized by the students, and about 54% of them were able to select the correct answer. So, between that, it was able to filter out, and the question performed as we expected it to, which was wonderful. And that's one that we definitely learned because it did. It combined our texture, it combined our form, and they had to analyze it. It was at the analysis level of Bloom's taxonomy, which really shows that our students were able to put together the pieces and do exactly what we wanted them to do with this unit. So on the flip side of that, if we talk about now our worst functioning items, let me see. So our 5 worst functioning items had discrimination values ranging between negative 0.34 and positive 0.24. So we had 2 of our questions that had a negative discrimination value. So both of those definitely warrant further investigation as to why that had happened. Another thing to notice is that in terms of difficulty level, we had between our most difficult was 62%, and then our easiest difficulty was 92%. So also worth noting here is that overall, if you look at our plausible distractors, most of these questions did not utilize all plausible distractors. So that's something that's telling for us, is that maybe something that would help this this discrimination value to go up is if we used distractors that maybe students would be more drawn to, and they would help them to kind of focus where we wanted them to be. So if we look at our worst performing item, which is question number 22, question 22 asks students to select the best answer describing the texture of an audio sample. So for this, we had about 70%, 69% of students chose the correct answer, and the remaining students selected one of our distractors. So they only utilized one other distractor for this question. And one of the things that, upon further reflection, we realized was that it was a choice of either, when we were describing the texture, being between thin and thick to thin. So when students were looking at this, we wonder if some of them maybe misheard it, or they weren't paying attention, or if our sample just wasn't long enough for students to be able to make an adequate assessment about the texture that they were hearing. So that's one that we would definitely revise if giving this test again. But overall, because our reliability coefficient was 0.88 overall, we still feel that this test did a pretty significant job measuring what we wanted it to do for our unit overall.
So in conclusion, the results of the multiple selection portion of the test shows that
test is a reliable measure of student understanding of musical form and texture. There are multiple items that require revision or greater focus in classroom instruction. However, we feel that the overall reliability and strength of 2 of our 3 constructed response questions allow the assessment to hold up under scrutiny. Thank you.